Welcome to the first lecture of the clothing masterclass. I am going to go over the absolute basics of fabric today because fabric is a big, crazy world that can go into a million billion different directions, and it's really easy to get lost. And so I understand why you're here right now, hoping for a little bit of clarity. Hopefully, I can give you some of that. So, with the very, very beginning, at the very beginning of clothing, is going to be a piece of cloth. And I know that's going to really rock some minds and some worlds, but like literally just a piece of cloth on the ground, right? You start with the basics. If you like took a towel and you laid it out, that's what you get. And now here's where the crazy starts happening. The crazy stuff starts happening is things can affect how this thing works. And there's two main ways a piece of fabric can be affected, and that is tension, forces, and this is like pulling, right? Like if you were to like pull on your shirt right now, right? That's a tension force. And then the other one is compression. And this is like where you squish it up. This is like rolling up your sleeve. And you can do there's different terms for this. Some people call it like, stretching or, pushing together, but these are the general forces. Either something is like being pulled, right? Or something is hanging or draping. So with that in mind, let's put these over to the side. It's our guiding light. And let's play with our little cloth here, shall we? Right? So new layer. We're going to mess with our little sheet of cloth here and see what can we do to it. What happens when I start playing with this thing? So first, what we're going to imagine that I'm going to grab it right here in the center with my fingers, right? My fingers are coming down and grabbing it. There's a really, really bad hand. We're not doing hands today. Don't worry about it. And I'm going to pick it up, right? And when I pick it up, this part here starts to, of course, come up with it. And eventually what you get is this sort of shape like this. This is the tension point up here where I'm grabbing it, right? Let's, right, here's a nice finger, right? There's a thumb. There's my other knuckles in the back, blah, blah, blah. And I'm grabbing it right there, creating this tension point. And what happens from a tension point, and I'm going to do a little aside here. If you want to, I fully encourage drawing along with me and playing with it as we go. I'm going to try not to go too slow or too fast. This is, of course, something you can review later. There will be videos of all of this. You can go through at your own pace. But you don't just got to listen to me. If you got a piece of paper and a pencil, by all means, have some fun. So when you have this tension point here, it creates these lines of radiation where things just come out. You can almost imagine like rays of the sun, right? And from these lines, you'll get these kinds of guides where it's sort of the fact let's see here. The fact your bad hands would take me forever to draw just proves it. Well, thank you very much. It's okay. I've drawn literally thousands of hands. Maybe we can talk about hands in the next one. I get that question a lot. Is that how do you do hands? Anyway, so these radiating points, right? You're gonna get this sort of effect like this. We're gonna keep it really basic here, right? Oh, my pen is fighting me. And from these sort of radiating points, you're gonna get the general form of your cloth. Does that all make sense so far? Let me see a single yes in the comments there. Beautiful, more than one. All right. So this attention point, and I have a couple examples which I'll show you, really simple ones to kind of get this across, which is right, bam, here. I found these on Pinterest, which nice and simple. So you can see here that there's something pinching them at the top and they're hanging, creating these radiation points, right? So let's just smush that. Smush, smush, smush. Make room for more talking, right? So let's draw on top of these and get some real life examples because I've always found that helps when you actually look at what's happening to real life because that's what drawing is, right? We're taking real life and breaking down what are the physics of the game engine we live in and how does it make sense, right? Because once you understand that, drawing becomes much more straightforward because you just understand how gravity and I don't know, magnetism work, right? The forces of nature as they were created by some greater force or whatever it may be. So you can see here's our tension point at the top, right? And here, as we zoom way in, you can see these lines of radiation, right? See how they all just kind of come off and they create these sort of these bands here? That's it right there, right? And as we move further down, they of course get further apart. Yes, the game engine we live in, exactly. Um, Now, something to keep in mind, of course, is if there's another tension point on the other side, you wouldn't see this soft arc. You would see, for instance, oop, you would start to see, this is just a little aside, I don't want to freak you out too much. You would start to see it pull on both sides, right? You'd see it doing this kind of thing. And this is, why am I hitting all the wrong buttons? I've used Photoshop for literally hundreds of hours and I'm hitting the wrong buttons. So like if you were to pull this, right, you would see the tension doing like this. If you were to like go grab a face cloth later, which I highly encourage and just kind of play with how it folds, if you pull it from both ends, you get these lines right down the middle, right? Because there's two tension points, right? Just a little aside there, make sure to give you like a warning of what's coming down the pipe. But right now, this is just simple radiation lines, right? We go over it, we trace it. You can see how these things form, right? Right. And there's just, and I'll even like do different colors here so you can see like it creates these sort of chunks, right? These undulations, right? Like there's a chunk there, right? Let's grab, I don't know, green's a color. Let's do green. Green's a good color, right? And it creates these just big sort of areas that become less prominent the further they are from the tension point. And let's do orange. Let's do orange for this one, right? And this is where I'm going to do a little aside and mention the severity or the size of these sorts of undulations, as we'll call them, they will vary with the texture and quality of the fabric, right? Really light, soft fabrics, like a silk, will have very gentle waves or undulations to it. Whereas if you have, say, like a denim or I'm not a seamstress. I don't know the names of fabrics, but if you have like a very thick fabric, like a stiff leather, these won't these will be more prominent than say on silk, right? And so that's where the nature of the fabric starts to come into play. So regarding how we shade things, I will get into that in like a couple seconds. Good question. But right now I'm just kind of pointing out the general line art of how these things work. So if we were to do this as line art, right? I'll block that out right now, right? Because it's important to see what the 2D line art would be before you start getting into complex things like, right? I would just sort of, and even what you can do here is you can imply these areas. You don't have to actually draw the whole thing out in a big block. You can just kind of like, it's sort of there, right? Because the strength of your line, it dictates essentially how hard the break in form is, right? If you have a very strong line, this suggests that there's a lot of um, let's call it visual information between these two spaces. I know that's kind of a loaded way to say that, but it means that there's a lot of distinction between those two forms, right? If I do these little thin lines, it's like, well, that's not that much of like a shade area. Whereas over here, there's a lot of stuff in between. So that's just a little nugget for you, right? And so if we were to actually just draw this out as line art, you would see something like that, right? And then let's look at our second one here. So you can see some more of these forms in action. Bum, bum. And then I will talk about the waves. So here we have our tension point. And here you see a fun bit, and why I picked this is it folds over. See that? And this is where it comes into this sort of what I want to talk about next and point out this really handy trick to cloth for you is this sort of edge line, right? If you're ever having a hard time with your cloth, stop thinking about all this in between stuff and think more about what your edges are doing, like over here, right? These edges, what are these doing, right? Like on this one here, this is the base, right? And from this base, And from this top, you can usually logic out what your piece of cloth should be doing, right? And now sometimes, because cloth is kind of sneaky, you're going to have to imagine the whole 3D shape of it, even though you can't see it, right? Like if we look at our fella here, right? New layer, this guy, we can see this one's really easy to see, right? But because we got big smart brains, we know this is a full piece of cloth, and somewhere in behind here is the other edge, right? Is that making sense? Can I see chat some yeses there? Or have I lost some people? Okay, so good. Some yeses. Got that awkward silence while I'm just staring at the chat, and then whoever watches this video later is going to have to deal with this weird little bit of silence. I'll have to put in some background music or something for the video. So, um, you have to remember this is like I would almost say this is critical, is that these edges, if you can keep them in your brain and keep track of like the 3D space of these objects, it will make fabric infinitely easier, right? Because if we go back to our new friend over here, right, where I was talking about the edges, you can see down here, there's this sneaky where it kind of comes in behind, right? This area right here, just ever so gently. But it's these little subtleties that really help you sell fabric because you understand that there's a fold happening here. Like what is this? What's actually happening? This is what I'm talking about. Waves is the fabric, this is from the bottom view, has done this, right? This is us looking directly up at it from this angle. We can't see this part here from the front, but it is in behind here, right? It's tucked up under. And this kind of awareness of what the cloth is doing in 3D space will help us immensely when it comes to shading things because we'll understand that the light coming from the front, the light source, is going to create shade underneath this fold here, right? Like if this is the bottom view, once more, all of this is going to be in shade because the light comes from here and this chunk of the cloth blocks out the light. Does that help answer your question there? I think that was Tenuviel, right? Let me just check that over. Yes, it was. Good. So that's where I was going with that. And that sort of knowledge will make shading cloth super duper easy. So let's just sort of wrap up our edges here, right? As we block this out. So there's a big chunk here. There's a big chunk here. And there's this sort of fold right here. And you can see a very gentle one here. A little hack to fabric is as you make these undulations, these sort of waves are, I think I mentioned this over here, they kind of tell you where your tension points should line up, right? So, like if I want to draw a piece of cloth hanging from a point, I can just sort of, here's my point, here's my wave, and I can just actually draw it out. And these upper points, as it goes up, that tells me that's an area that gets light. As it goes down, that tells me it's an area that gets shade. So, like I can shade in here, right? Right? See that? There's like a little hack there. And you can even get kind of weird with it. Like if I just draw something sort of random, I know from my tension point, all these lines will radiate out and it will create the form for me. See that? And I can just sort of draw everything in. That's crooked. Don't tell anybody that I made a crooked line. I am a perfect artist all the time, right? And then you can see this creates the form of the fabric, right? And so, and it just follows the form because all you do is think about it as 3D space, and all of a sudden you have this weird piece of kooky fabric all done, right? So that's how you shade these forms. These sort of like they're almost like cylinders, right? And I will actually, before I get into compression, I'll mention that like if we were to think, yeah, I got lots of time. If we were to think of our piece of cloth here, right, from the side, let's say these parts come in, you start to get this kind of effect, right? Let's make that a little smaller. I don't have a big enough canvas for this, right? Let's say that starts to come in. And our line just starts to come in like that and come in like that. And we're going to just till it's like just tucked right in. Remember I was talking about following your edges, right? The other edge is going to do that. and it's going to do that, and it's going to do that. And right now, this is like, what the hell is he talking about? But you just connect your edges. See? And this is where you have to think about this in 3D space, because a lot of this area here that I just sketched out, you won't actually see, but it connects to your guideline, right? And so once you understand this 3D form nonsense, it makes it very, very hard to actually draw your cloth wrong, right? So if we clean that up a little bit, so if we clean that up, right, things a little nicer, right? You can start to see the actual forms here. And then this, of course, goes in shade, and this goes in shade, and right? We clean it up, and this is how folds work. And you can imagine if you have a bunch of these things, right, and they start doing this, you have like a skirt, right? And you have this big pleat, and there's her skirt, right? Okay. We feeling really confident about tension now? Excellent. So that brings us to our next little bit here, and that is compression or draping. So we grab our little friend here. Once again, what is this? This is, I have three references. Oh, yes, I do have three references. There's the simple one there. Right. All of these from your friendly neighborhood Pinterest, which is an artist's dear, dear friend. You should hang out there all the time because the references are usually pretty excellent for just about anything you want to find. Yeah, we're going to have to practice. That's super important. That's the other half. I can give you all the little secrets and the know-how, but you got to think about putting pencil to paper. And I highly recommend focusing on pencil and paper over digital because it really strips away all of the noise of digital. Because when you open up Photoshop or Procreate or I don't know, Coral Painter, I think it's called, right? There's just like there's a million buttons and they go into all kinds of crazy things. You can liquefy things, you can warp things, you can mess with the perspective. You have every color known to mankind in front of you at a touch of a button. And that stuff is actually very unnecessary, or like it's more like the 20%, right? You can get an 80%. Honestly, I mean, there's guys that just do like nothing but pencil. Actually, that question, Robert, I was about to mention that right now. When you're doing draping, this comes back to that point of drawing your bottom line and then your top line right away, because then you can just connect the lines, right? So the basics of draping is like this is like imagine there's a stick here, right? There's your sticky stick, and your piece of cloth from like right here is now, this is the line here, so you don't lose track of things, is now hanging, right? You've picked it up, and there's some kind of object holding it up, right? And now, if you have this perfectly straight, right? So you can do that, right? You just put a piece of cloth directly over top of something. It will hang without any kind of distortions for the most part, right? You'll see maybe like a little bit, but you'll get a very, very simple form. Now, the thing is, this comes back to the point of compression, is these areas can be scrunched in. And as you scrunch in these little areas, what's going to happen is our poor defenseless little cloth, I'll just scooch this in like this and modify it. It's going to start to bunch up, right? I'm just messing with this here. And as it bunches up, you're going to create, to Robert's question, these waves, right? And it's going to create waves as it bunches up. And you can kind of see this in the tension thing too, is all fabric really does is it goes from like a straight state into some kind of bunch state because the material still exists as it moves together. It just kind of starts to pile into itself. Like maybe you don't get a wave, but it starts to like lay on top of itself if it's on the floor, right? And so even though if you pull this out, sorry, that's a horrible arrow. If you pull this out, you'll get a straight line. But of course, reality is not like that. Fabric isn't always going to just stay in a straight line. In fact, it rarely does. But this is the kind of thing to keep in mind is that just because it's scrunched up, parts of the fabric doesn't disappear. It's just underneath other fabric, and that's where the weird forms come from, right? And that's when you have to start thinking about like all the thickness and the thinness and the crispness and the blah 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 blah. That makes clothing just so absolutely daunting. So back to our point here of the waves is it creates these bunches, right? It bunches up, right? And I think this up here is an oops, this is an excellent example of what's happening there, right? So let's put our stick in so we can see that stick because this is now a new piece of clothing or cloth. And you can see it creates these forms, right? Here's forms. Form, 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 form. Form, 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 form. Just channel blocking, right? And to the point of our dear Robert, this is where you have that flow at the bottom. And you can draw this right off the bat and just use this as your guiding light to connect and create all of these forms on the draped fabric, right? And to the point of line art or shading, again, the more aggressive the bend, the more strong the line or the shade you want, and the more gentle the form, the less aggressive the shade of the line. Because that's all lines are. Lines just delineate between form, right? Because that's all we're really doing is we're just trying to capture 3D form in 2D space. And we have tools like light or lines to help communicate this to viewers. Because that's all you're really doing is someone's going to look at your image and you've compiled visual information for them to process with their human brain, right? It goes in their eyes, occipital lobe, when they process it, and then it gives them some kind of image or idea. And so when you get to the real fundamentals of this stuff, that's going to be your real bread and butter when you get really advanced, is kind of like playing with these underlying fundamentals of what is a visual language. And again, I don't want to freak anybody out, but that's how you get really confident with this stuff is you have to like stop going and looking at like this is a towel. No, you have to break this down like this is a collection of form and form information. How can I best communicate that using a 2D language like a pencil, right? Because that's what you're really doing. And the more you understand that, the easier it gets to make all these wacky forms because you're working with the really fundamental pieces, right? There's less of a middleman between you and what you're trying to make if you're just playing with the fundamentals. Now, hopefully that doesn't is not freaking anybody out. That's how I like to think about this and how I've kind of gotten to where I am. Maybe it'll help you, maybe it won't, but it's out there now and I can't take it back. So, back to the friggin' drape here, right? And I brought this all that little diatribe up because this happens to have right here what I'm talking about is up here are really strong delineations in form, right? But as it gets down, it sort of peters out. Like it's thick and then it thins out. Thick and it thins out, right? And this is where that kind of thinking can get really, really helpful when you're working with these forms. Because cloth is really sneaky. It's super, super, super sneaky. And so that's why you have to kind of think in this really fundamental way, or at least I find it helps. So, now that we're going to come back from very crazy kooky land, if you were to say, look at this wave form on the bottom from a bottom view, like if you were to sit under it and look up at it, right? Ooh, I'm some weirdo looking up at a curtain, right? You would see, let me look at think about this. It comes up and then down and that, and then it has a big one up and something like that, right? And this one actually kind of tucks under a little, it looks like. Tucks under, right? And so with the light source coming down, this is where you get that shade, right? In these valleys. There's shade in the valleys. Yeah, right down in the valley so low. Right? And then because we're having this because there's like a natural radiation, right? The radiation points we're talking about with tension. You can see, I will go over here, grab this blue. There is an ever so slight radiation to it because as much as I said there's tension and compression, functionally they're kind of the same thing, right? Some kind of outside force is bunching your fabric together. Your perfect straight fabric is getting bunched by some kind of nonsense bully outside force. And so tension and compression are just kind of helpful jargon to sort of when you want to talk to other artists about like what's happening, but functionally it's the same thing. And so that's why you still have these radiating lines because you can see it's much tighter up top here, right? See how it's all tight, and down here it's this nice like kind of loosey wave, and there's this slight sort of flare to it, right? Now it's not going to like do this, right? But there's just a slight radiation to your folds. See that? Everyone follow along so far. I didn't go too fast. And all kinds of kooky, technical jargon nonsense. Pardon, just having a sip of water. Perfect, 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 perfect. So let's look at some more functional examples over here. So we'll turn off these fellas. Bang, bang, bang. Nope, I want you. Yeah, I want you. Let's do good old black and red, right? So let's start with our fella on the left here. And this comes back to my point of imagining the form even though you can't see it, right? We see this line here, but it's also behind here, right? It doesn't go away. It's right there. And it's probably not even doing straight stuff. It's probably doing weird stuff where it's like bending a little bit, right? Even though you can't see it, it's there. And then bam, it's back, right? All of a sudden, she's back. Even though there's fabric behind here, there it is. And so then this comes down, and then whoa, what the heck is this? She's back again, right? And it's these little sneaky parts that, if you keep track of them, really help you make clothing and fabric into magic, right? And up here, same thing. It's folding, right? And what does that mean? That means like if we zoom way the heck in, that's it. That's way too zoomed in. But there's fabric is it's bent over, right? It's doing this, and then it's bent over, and then it's doing this, and it's bent over, and it's doing this. And these areas here, and I'm zoomed so far in you can't even really tell what's going on anymore, but hopefully that makes sense. These sort of areas are where you get your money when you do fabric, is understanding that the fabric doesn't stop existing when it's folding over itself. It just exactly right. Thank you. I'll read that. Despite common belief, fabric does not disappear behind itself, right? And that's, I think, where I see a lot of people get kind of lost on fabric is they don't think about it from a really logical perspective, even though it's almost like you have to do like it's almost like a math equation, right? Where you just have to kind of sit down and think, okay, if I have a piece of fabric and this is what's happening to it, how does it react? Right? And fabric is really susceptible to that kind of thinking because fabric doesn't fight force, right? Fabric just accepts what's happening to it. If and there's very little tension to it. Like if you put a human body in a strong breeze, they're not jiggling like crazy. There's a lot of tension to human tissue, right? And there's a lot of tension to things like, like a piece of steel. It doesn't react at all. But fabric accepts all force and reacts to all force, whether it's wind or pulling or any kind of input, fabric reacts to it. And so that's what makes fabric so unpredictable, but it is predictable, but it makes it kind of weird to deal with because it just has like an infinite number of ways of sitting, I guess, right? And so once again, there's a little tangent there, but I guess that's why we're here. And so to that point of this folds, right? See that? Maybe this is a better way to show it. The top of this thing is doing this. And then from here, right? And then it comes down and it's folded over. And it comes down. And here you see those chunks I was talking about, right? From these folds. Right? Here's like this one. Doot, 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 doot. Hopefully this is making sense. Right? And then here's one of our folds and it comes down. And it gets gentler as it comes down. Big one, big one. Oh, it gets gentler. Right? Big, big fold. Oh, but it gets gentler because we're radiating down as the compression, the tension mix and create our fabric, right? And once again, imagining this from the bottom, there's an upward fold towards the light and it comes down, and an upward fold, and then we're at the edge, right? And that's how tension works. And then we have another example over here where once again you can see here's the bottom and then it kind of disappears. It's actually like right in behind, and then it reappears again. And it comes down and it folds up again, right? And down. Oh, and it's in behind. And it folds up. And I'm exaggerating here so you can see. But this one's a good example for like, say I want to draw a piece of clothing draped over something. I can just like plot these lines out and have a really good idea for how my clothing should work. So like, let's say I have these random lines here and I put my string here, right? There's my string. Don't touch it. And I want to say, I don't know, drape it like probably about like that. I can then link these forms together and get an idea of what my cloth should be doing, right? And I can just sort of start refining it, right? Here's a bunch, and remember, it kind of bunches in between, right? And here's a form, there's a form, and you can see all of a sudden, I'm kind of drawing a piece of clothing, even though I just made a bunch of random lines and I connected them. But now it kind of looks sort of like there's something hanging here. See what I mean? So when you're like, I'm a little lost, what do I do? Just start at the top, start at the bottom, and then connect your forms using the logic of how cloth bunches, right? And I can even make it fancier here, and I can like do a little zigzag or something, right? Say I want to get fancy, I do a little zigzag, bang, 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 boom, right? No, that's actually it's kind of neat too, right? And so there, with that, is the basic basics of draping, compression, tension, and the really fundamental ways a piece of cloth can be manipulated. So with that, I'm going to take a little pause here and ask, do we have any questions about the basic basics? Yes, fabric is very complex in its simplicity. I actually find that even though at first fabric is very daunting, as you advance, it becomes quite fun to work with because it doesn't really ever get super straightforward. You'll notice when you look at the old masters, you know, like the Renaissance painters, they do a lot of fabric studies because fabric is just so just there's it's unpredictable, right? It's always different, and there's always a different way you can bend it or light it, and it's just such a fun way to sort of like go. Reality is just so fun. Okay, so before I get into different types of fabric, I am going to do a little sort of bonus one here about this sort of following the form thing, just to hammer this thing into your heads forever, I hope. Watch this. I'm gonna just draw this big loosey line. Right? It's totally made it up. And watch this. I'm gonna just do this same line, put it up here. But do it a little later, right? This is the top guideline, and these parts here, like where I mentioned how fabric doesn't go away because you can't see it. I'm just gonna connect these, right? I got my two sketchies, bang bang, and let's just connect them, right? Here's one. Oh, let's do black here, and here's the top line, right? I could trace better than that. I'm a professional artist, right? Make this a little lighter so hopefully it's less confusing to viewers, right? Wow. There we go, right? And we just sort of trace our lines. I just made two big loosey-goosey lines, but all of a sudden, you connect these, turn these off. We have a ribbon that makes sense. See that? And you could do this as crazy kooky as you want. I could just make like a big, I don't know, big crazy line like that. And if you just follow the folds, all of a sudden, it starts making sense. See that? So that's to the point of guidelines. Guidelines are really, really helpful with clothing. And if this was like, say, a towel or a cloth or something, these top parts probably aren't going to be here. And it might just kind of go up forever, right? Actually, probably about just hit undo a bunch of times. You know, the old artist special, hitting Control Z over and over and over until you get something useful, right? Let's say I just connect these like that. See that? Looks like a piece of fabric, doesn't it? But all I did was I just started with this line here, right? I just made a squiggle and then I just started adding other connections to it, and all of a sudden it looks like I'll take this and just shrink it down. All of a sudden we got ourselves a piece of cloth from a tension point. See that? And I can also take these parts and squish them up. But all of this started from that simple little squiggle in the middle, right? Just bunching up. And next week I will get into more technical folds, things like, how things sit on arms and sleeves and like all the different ways you can take these two forces of tension and compression and do really weird stuff with them. Not weird, it's like really standard stuff, but it's going to be weird if you don't know what clothing does, right? Everything's weird until you figure it out. And then you sit there like, "Oh, that was actually really simple. Was I just stupid?" No, you're just new to it. And when you walk into a room and you don't know the room very well, it's all very daunting. But as long as you keep practicing, it'll soon make absolute sense to you, to the point where you won't be able to believe it ever didn't make sense. So let's look at thick versus thin, right? Let's call this one the ribbon one. Boom, 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 boom. We're just ripping through it. We're just doing a great job. So all of a sudden, we have a thick and a thin one, right? I got to say that blanket on the left looks real comfy. I kind of want to hang out with that blanket on the left there, but I do live in a cold place, so that one on the right looks like I'm gonna freeze. Oh, a question here. Let's see. Can I cover something like bandanas in the future? Adding volume of the head of the hair, then adding fabric is weird. I can talk about that right now. Do you mean bandanas, like the pirate bandana thing where like you tie it behind your head? Yeah, sure. So that's actually a great example. I'll take a little aside here. Or you know what? Let me continue with the lecture because this is supposed to be something someone can review later. We'll make a note and I'll come back to that for the quote unquote Q&A section. I'll just make a note here for bandana on head. Okay. We'll come back to that. It's the whole like flow lesson plan thing here. Okay. So this part's going to be pretty quick. It's just to kind of point out to make sure you're mindful about different fabric thicknesses. And so if we look at our two fabrics here, you can see that light fabric, and what happens here is light fabric is very, very thin. There's no body to it, right? And so if we look like right here, let's make these lighter. It just kind of sits on itself. It doesn't even fight it at all, right? It just sits right on top of itself because there's no thickness. Whereas if you look at a thick piece of fabric, this same thing here is there's going to be more. Like I'll just move this over. Hopefully you'll see what I'm talking about. There's going to be body to the fabric, right? So like this might be more like, you know, uh, you'd see probably something more like, let me think about it for a sec. Yeah, I'll explain it like this actually. Here, it's like if we imagine a 3D form here, there's form to it. See what I mean? Like there's going to be thickness to the fabric, and you have to take into account this thickness of the fabric as it exists with it. Sorry, I lost complete train of thought there. As it exists and folds, right? So, like, as it's thick, there's going to be body to the fabric, right? And so when it pools on itself, right? Like, remember those squiggly lines we were talking about? If it's a thick piece of fabric, you have to take account of the body of the fabric, right? This is the side here. I'm going like over the top with this to get this point across, but it's going to be body, right? Body. And so then there's all this in between nonsense. I'll use a different color just so we don't lose track of things here, right? There's this kind of body to the fabric, right? Does that make sense? and I will answer that question in a second. But I want to make sure you understand that the main difference between a thin and a thick fabric is you have to account for the thickness of thicker fabrics because it will pile onto itself. Okay. So, um, to these two questions, that comes actually to the next part, which is kind of crisp versus loose fabrics, and that's how much natural tension is within the fabric. So these ones here, I picked two very loose fabrics, right? They're very soft. They don't really hold much body to them. You could just throw them on the ground and they would just sit there in a very limp, pathetic pile, right? And so when you think of like, does thinner fabric have more folds and more smaller folds because it's not fighting itself, or should it look more rounded? Is a question of body. So, um, on the matter of fighting itself, if you have a thick fabric, a very limp, loose, thick fabric, you can still have the same amount of folds easily. You just have to account for the body of the fabric to make sure that you like, if I were to say we do this classic zigzag here, right? Do a thin one. If I have a thin fabric and it's just doing this is just a side view. It's very thin, so it just kind of sits on top of itself, right? Like these spaces here wouldn't even be visible. I'm just kind of exaggerating so you can see the logic of it. This was a thick fabric, right? I'll make my brush thicker. It's the exact same amount of folds. Because I got a big fat old fabric, I have to account for that thickness, right? And so they get fatter folds, right? Does that answer your question about the thin fabric and the more fold and the more smaller folds? More squashed, flat equals limp or thin. More or less, yes. Um, let's move on to the next part, and hopefully this will add some clarity because I'm seeing some questions here like, well, what about love? Um, right? So to the point I think we're seeing here is how much body does a fabric have? So on the left is a piece of like a leather blanket, and on the right it looks like linen. And what happens is in heavier fabrics, there will be some resistance to outside forces. So, like for instance, if I try and apply these folds to this hard leather that we see here, and I will double this up so it's still here, right? If I try and apply these folds to this thick piece of leather, it's not going to pool really clean, right? So, like for instance, when I was talking about these folds, whoop, ba-doop, ba-doop, don't want that. Um, Remember that I said that these sort of the space here wouldn't actually happen if it was to pool. Like if I put a heavy fabric, a loose, limp, heavy fabric on the ground, it's going to sit just like a thin fabric, but you have to take account of the thickness of the fabric. So instead of like this, you're going to see this is for a heavy, loose fabric. It's actually going to be kind of like, sorry, that is not maxed out. It's going to be doing like this, right? But that thickness of the blue is to show the body of the fabric, right? Here's our thick blanket. Now, if it's, for instance, say a heavier fabric and it's creasing, quote unquote, more than folding, what's going to happen is you're going to see natural resistance to it. So it might do something more like this, right? Or let's because I have to kind of exaggerate the fold so you can't really see might happen. Like it'll sit much closer. But like for instance, if there's tension, you might see more kind of jagged sort of shapes, right? That's really the difference, is it kind of has this sort of angular quality to it, the heavier it is, because it can support itself. Because like if you say this was like, if I go like really extreme, if this was a piece of metal, like it can do this because the metal is very strong, and then you get all of a sudden you have sheet metal. You know what I mean? Even though that's not fabric, it kind of behaves like it. See what I mean? And so just the more tension that naturally exists in your material, the more it will resist pooling into these flat, squishy shapes. Does that help make some more sense out of your questions? Right? Okay, good. And so the more rigidity you have, the more it will fight this natural folding behavior. And that's really the only piece you really need to understand versus crisp versus loose, because it's like a really, really tense fabric, really anxious fabric. The best I could think of was leather, because leather tends to have a lot of natural body to it because it's, I guess, I don't know. I'm not a biologist, but I think there's like a lot of protein or something in it, like dried collagen, or I don't know. I'm definitely out of my depth now. I do not know enough about leather to be making these comments, but I am trying. Um, and so if we look at our other example here of the linen, you can see that there is very little resistance to the folds that are happening to the cloth, right? And that's why I put these next to each other, because I thought it was nice and juxtaposing, because you can see here on the leather how it's forming these kind of natural pockets, even though that doesn't really make sense. Like what is this? Like it's bunching up here that doesn't really make sense for fabric being affected by gravity, right? Like there's a resistance here. Do you see that? Do you guys see what I'm talking about? Yes. Okay. Right? Or like for instance, you can also see it right here where if this was a limp fabric, you wouldn't have this kind of tension point right here, right? It would probably just kind of pool down like this because it's not going to fight against itself, right? This would probably just kind of come down. If this was just like a limp fabric, it would just probably just kind of come down like that, and you wouldn't see these. And you can also see up here, actually, see how big these bundles are, right? This is because it's fighting the natural force, right? If this was a like linen cloth, this would just kind of fold over itself. And I know this isn't like the angle is not great, but does that make sense? Do you see what I'm talking about? Do I have to like try and explain it a different way? Waiting for oh, that awkward wait for the chat. Dum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-bum, bum. Mm, I'm not, is it okay? Still confusing. Okay. So, well, with that, let's move into, I mean, that kind of goes over the basics of the fabric at this point. So I'll mention for anybody watching this after the fact, what you want to do at this point, if it's still confusing, and there's a good chance it might be, so you don't feel too bad if you're like, you saw this, and you're like, I don't necessarily know. What I highly recommend is go find some pieces of simple fabric, base cloths, towels. Try and find ones that are thin and delicate. Try and find pieces of fabric that are heavy and on the more tense side, things like a leather or a thick blanket, and just lay them out and play with it a little bit, right? Fold it over itself, make simple tension, compression um, shapes with your piece of fabric, and then try and like sketch it out, right? Because if you want to make this make sense, you have to sit down and you have to practice. I'm sorry I can't just download it into your head like it's the Matrix, but we're not there yet. Hopefully, someone figures out Neuralink. I don't know. With that, oh, a question here. Chris, versus heavy versus thick and thin versus limp versus stuff is confusing. Could you define these terms more clearly? If not, I get this is a lot. That's okay. Okay. So let's think of this is actually a great way to just round out the first lecture here. Personally, I think of this in, let's call it two dichotomies. And a dichotomy is like an inseparable set of halves, like, up and down, left and right. They're like a relationship of two opposites, right? So I think of this as thick versus thin is your first relationship, and the other one is, I'd call it crisp versus loose, right? And when you have um any piece of fabric, it can be affected by one of these two relationships. Or sorry, it's affected by both these relationships, but it's one of these factors within it. So you can have a crisp, thick fabric or a crisp, thin fabric. You can have a loose, thick fabric or a loose, thin fabric, right? Only one of each. Either it's one of these or it's one of these, right? And so if I were to like come up with some examples of like, say, a thick and crisp fabric, you're probably going to get probably like a leather, right? Like a dried kind of leather, like a leather blanket. That has a thick, crisp quality to it, right? You have to account for the body of it because it's not as thin as a wisp, and it fights itself because there's natural structure to the fabric. If I think of a thick and loose fabric, probably fur, right? Like an animal fur blanket. There's a lot of body to it, but it doesn't fight itself. It's very soft, it's very malleable. If I think of, say, thin and crisp, you could think of maybe like a unrefined linen, like a really like a brand new linen dress shirt has a lot of kind of tension to it, but it's very thin, right? So it'll kind of hold. The heck is that? Pardon, that was an alarm. Everyone can have that in the recording later. This is my little chunk of Gurren Lagann sound reminding me that the lecture is technically over, but I'm gonna keep going because we're not done yet. So this is like a like new linen shirt, right? The best I could think off the top of my head. Um, and then we have thin and loose. I can think of like a silk. It's a good example, right? Does that help clarify it? With some actual fabric examples of what behaves like these. Perfect. Okay, so I think that is a good wrap up for the first lecture. With that, we'll move on to the question period. Go for like however long we need to, or like 15 minutes, whatever. Go over some questions and just make sure everyone has a good understanding of these cloth basics. And so the first question we have here. So while I do this next one, to all of you here in the chat, think of your questions, stew on them, get them all loaded and ready. You can dump them in the chat if you want while I talk. And I'm going to go over the point of a bandana on someone's head, right? So, boom, 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 boom. Let's do actually a bandana is here. So I'm going to need a head to talk about this. So we're going to do this from the side. Right here, I'm going to just draw a simple head, right? Nothing too crazy. Let's do from the side and then 3/4. Oop. All right, so there's 3/4. There's the side. They're horrified apparently, right? It's a simple face, nothing too crazy. We can find that a little, right? Nose, nose, perfect. You have a really big chin. All of a sudden, I'm trying to draw poses in front of everybody, but we're supposed to be drawing bandanas. So here are our faces. We're going to talk about bandanas and actually applying a sheet of cloth. So the first thing to keep in mind is when you have a bandana, just a square of cloth, this part here, when you put it on your head, it comes over and it folds over to this part. So what you get is this kind of thing, right? It folds over itself and you have this sort of shape, right? And we'll call this point A, B, and C, like I'm doing Pythagoras or something, right? And so when you put this thing on your head, you line it up. Here's point A, here's B and C. They're stacked, right? We can maybe do it like this. You can kind of see, right? Maybe here's C over here, right? And it goes onto the head. Let's make these a little this small so you can kind of see what the process is here, right? So now it goes onto the head, and what's going to happen is you have this kind of thing happen, right? This is A right here, and then B and C come around the back. And this is this head. I've made too many layers and okay, right? And what's going to happen because you have, and then of course they knot, right? They knot back here. That's how a bandana works. And so you have a knot back here, shadoop-a-doop, and that just does a little foldy. And then you have this happening. And then what's going to happen if we talk about like our radiation lines is you're going to have tension points here because this is off the head, right? My pen is fighting me. What? Why you like this? Need to draw. There we go. My tablet just had a little moment there. Oh, it's being very strange. Okay, so there's a tension point here, and there's a tension point here. You got to remember that our fabric is kind of like this. And so there's tension points here, and there's tension points here, right? And you can use those to draw out the actual lines of what the bandana is doing. So if I were to say make this a little lighter, to even lighter, and draw in the actual bandana, you'd probably get, there's the actual fold of it, right? And then it would get kind of like tension like this, right? And tension, 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 right? And tension, tension, tension. And then that's how you draw a bandana. And you probably actually wouldn't see this much in the back. You might get like a little pocket here, but that's how you actually logic the cloth out. Okay. Does that help answer the bandana question? Yeah, even on the front of the head here, like if I draw it on the front, right? Boop, boop, you're gonna get tension across the forehead, right? And it might even like fold a bit like this because you have to be very aware of what's pulling on the fabric, right? If this was a really loose bandana, like if it's too big for them, you're not gonna see much tension. You might see something like this, right? If their head is like absolutely bursting, you're gonna see it pulling all across the head from all kinds of points, right? And so hopefully that makes sense for bandanas. Does that help clarify the bandana point? Tinuvio. I didn't actually need the other heads. Do those. Okay, so that out of the way. Let's see what other questions we have. This might be an odd question, but I'm curious about skin folds. Do they work like clothing? I'm also curious if head hair follows certain clothing rules. Yes, actually. So this skin is an example of an extremely tense material because there's a lot of natural body to human skin. It's very robust. But if you think of like, say, I know the exact area. Let's draw. Here's a shoulder. Let's make that a little bigger, right? Right. Here's a shoulder. There's a collarbone. There's your neck muscle. Here's an arm, right? This part right here folds up. Here's a nipple. It's smiling, right? This part right here creates folds, right? And these follow that same logic of going up and down and it undulates, right? But they're super gentle, right? So skin is the same thing. Same thing with an elbow, right? If we were to do an elbow, and you're folding it up, right? So here's like here's your shoulder, right? And shoulder. Just block this out. I'll erase these afterwards. Right? Your shoulder, if you like scrunch your arm right up, right? And you're like, I don't know, you have a fist here. You're pumping iron, right? Here's your 1,000 pounds, right? This area right here will form little pieces of tension. And if we zoom into these, right? There's our little zoom in box. It's gonna blow out, boom, boom, right? What's happening is you're getting little undulations in the skin, right? And it's forming those kinds of folds where the elbow and the forearm and the bicep are meeting, right? So it follows the same logic, but you just have to be very mindful of skin having a lot of resistance to it. Does that answer your question, Ronald? Half of it. Oh, there's another one. Oh, I see. Head hair. Yes, head hair is a really good example of a very thick and loose fabric. So, like I said, fur is hair, right? So, if we think of hair, um, right? If what hair, this is of course its own lecture to talk about hair, but hair tends to exist in these kinds of bunches that hang off the head, right? And if say this is a person's head and they just have one strand of hair because they're in a punk band and they decide to lay down on a pillow, this, we're going to lay down on a pillow with our punk hair. Um, the hair does bunch up, right? It'll do that. But the thing is with hair is every single strand of hair can kind of fall under this logic. Hair does tend to clump into its own like sort of call it regional strands, it's little collectives. But every single strand of hair can function under these rules of like limp fabric. Like if I had a single strand of hair and I just, held it, pink, right? And I lower my hand or where I'm grabbing it, it's going to start to kind of cool, right? Or actually, I mean, hair can actually have a lot of tension, so it might even do something like this and it curls. And so when you think about hair, and this is a huge, huge aside, because hair has its own kind of unpredictability and logic to it that's kind of like clothing, but kind of not like clothing. But a simple answer is you can think of hair like thick, loose fabric, and you're going to be fairly close. But don't take that as the word on it because that I can't give a very in-depth answer on that in like 5 minutes because that's its own lecture. Hair is I get a lot of questions about hair too, actually. Can you believe it? People ask me about how do you draw hair? Um, is that satisfactory enough to give you some idea? Okay, good. Let's see what else we got here. How would you show folds and shadow in knots like the bandana? Bandanas are actually a very good way to practice um fabric because they're a very thin, light fabric, and so they bend in all kinds of fun ways, and they're not super big, so you don't get like overwhelmed. Like if I take a bandana and let's put it around somebody's neck, right? I think we actually have a little where's the neck doodle? Perfect. No, that's not, it's too straight. So let's see if I can find a picture of a bandana to actually really hammer this. Bandana. We want one around the neck. Wow, where's a picture of a bandana? You guys are you kidding me? It's like women wearing bandanas in every way except for the one that I want them to wear it, which is like around their neck. Okay, so Pinterest did fail me today, even though I gave it a shout out earlier. So that's awkward. I'm gonna have to send them a very stern email about that. We're just gonna have to make it up as we go. So if we do a bandana, let's say here's a little knot here, boom, boom, and it's just hanging around someone's neck, right? Or no, let's remove the neck thing. I'm gonna make it confusing. Um, if we have that sort of tension point I was talking about, right? This is like around here. It's the better angle, right? Here's someone's neck or head or whatever it may be. These are your tension points, right? Here's the tension point. Here's the tension point. Let's use red. Red's good for this, right? Tension point, tension point. Ah, and then here's the drape point, right? Or gravity's pulling on it. You're going to see these kinds of shapes. And you're like, well, where do I shade? You shade in between these shapes because you have to remember from the side, it's doing this, right? It's kind of bunching up as it hangs from someone's neck, right? And so how does a form work? Well, if you have a cylinder, right? You shade underneath where the light's not, or the opposite of where the light's hitting. That's how a cylinder works. So if you're thinking, where do I light it? This, these are your shade areas, right? Shade. You got to remember that this thing up here will cast shade, and this stuff receives no light in here because it's completely cut off from a light source, right? If this is a light source, you get this is your shade area, right? This is a shade area, right? Does that make sense? This kind of gets into actually the next lecture a little bit. I was going to, this is an introductory to the shade because I will get into this next week much more in depth as we talk about more complex folding patterns. Here, unless I see something else, so I'm gonna keep going forward unless I see something else. Shadow and knots. Here, I'll just sort of block it in, right? You would see like a shadow, you know, here, a shadow here, and a shadow here, and here. And so that's how you'd kind of, and then you'd also see it along the tension points, right? There's your general shadows, right? Would jeans denim be thick and crisp? Trying to make sure I could connect the dots in my brain and apply it. So that would depend on well, the jeans themselves. New jeans are pretty crisp. They're sort of a medium thickness, so they kind of fall in between. But if you get like, vintage Levi 501s or whatever the kids are into these days, it's going to be more on the thin, loose side because it's a very softened fabric. And so if you're not sure about what it's doing, I would go and do studies. That's the part that's going to be missing if you're not sure how to connect the dots in your brain is you need to go and do the actual studies of clothing. Go and find some pairs of jeans and play with them, right? Spend 15 minutes, half hour a day, just kind of throwing a piece of clothing around and just sort of like, what does this actually do? And the more you do that, your brain's going to start to integrate more and more of how things should work. You get like a really strong intuition of what the fabric or the material would be doing as you start to integrate what's thick, what's crisp, what's thin, what's loose, and what are all the in-betweens. Because those aren't like the four pillars of categories. There's a lot of in between, right? Because maybe something is like maybe it's kind of crisp, maybe it's kind of not crisp, right? Maybe what's the middle of crisp and loose, like cruse, lisp, like it's lispy, thick fabric. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of in between. What I've pointed out are just the four major categories that you could put a lot of fabrics into. Is that fabric is a spectrum exactly? So is that answering your questions so far? You feel a little bit of a light bulb starting to light up, and I will get more into the bandana kind of stuff next week for sure. That is actually most of next week's content is fancy folds. In a good way though. Yes, I know. This is quite the load of information. Uh I suppose you guys are here for a reason. Clothing is kind of one of the real deciding factors if you feel comfortable doing illustration or not. Because I mean, you see a lot of folks, they'll just kind of guess at their clothing. They'll just sort of throw some lines down and hope for the best. I see it all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but there's no real actual wrong in art. Um, there's accurate if you want to be accurate, but also you can draw completely wrong and you if you want, and that's technically still art. So it only just depends on how much you want to, I suppose, impress people and be accurate and technical. Oh, I missed this. Is skin thick and loose then? Once you're over 65. Yeah, I don't. If you spend all your life in the sun and you don't eat a lot of collagen, yes, your skin will be thick and loose. I mean, that's actually something to keep in mind with skin is it depends on the age of the person. If you have a child, their skin is still very fresh. It's got a lot of collagen in it. There's a lot of tension to it, right? There's a lot of elastin. And so the folds on their bodies are very, very subtle and gentle. Whereas you take, a 100-year-old man who's lived in Arizona his entire life, his skin is thick and loose, right? And the folds he makes will impress people for miles around. And so that's a great way to just cap this up. That is a good ending note. Um, unless there's more questions, which, by the way, if you have them, please type them before I end the call. But your guiding light for fabric is start to entertain the ideas of tension and compression, and then start to entertain the ideas of different types of fabric and how they will be tensed or compressed differently. Oversized scarf. Yeah, that's a next week kind of thing. Next week. So as far as what to do now to those here. So next week, in case you still have more questions and you're like, what are we talking about? I'm going to get into the nuances of folds and wrinkles. This is like, how does a shirt bunch at an elbow? How does, for instance, a scarf sit around one's neck? Things like zigzag folds and wave folds, and just how we can actually play with fabric interacting with other objects instead of just, a simple stretch or a compression of a piece of fabric that's just lying in front of you. What does it actually, what does it do in the real world? And then after that, I'm going to get into interacting with the human body specifically. So hopefully after that, we'll have a little bit more clarity for your homework. I would find very simple pieces of cloth, bandanas, face cloths, towels, and just lay them out and practice drawing very simple folds. That's it. The scarf thing. I'll make a note for the oversized scarf. I mean, if not, if you make the third one, you can just ask the question. I'll just go over it. But I think the next one will kind of cover that a little bit as we get into more nuanced fold patterns. And then, of course, if anybody has any questions and they want me to review work or anything, just get in touch with me. You can email me. You can do it on Discord, Instagram. However you want to get in touch, I'm yours for the month. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So, with that, I will hopefully see everybody next week.